Some photographs have no right to exist. So deeply disturbing are these images that medical experts have questioned if displaying them is a violation of human dignity. In 1971, within a forgotten part of rural Virginia, a young woman gave birth to something that challenged every known fact about human genetics, family bloodlines, and the murderous secrets families guard. Sarah Mae Whitaker was her name. And upon seeing what emerged from her womb, 3 doctors immediately left the delivery room. One of them would never practice medicine again. The child born that October morning was more than just a product of incest. It represented the culmination of something far more sinister, a bloodline so tangled, so polluted by generations of intentional inbreeding that scientists would later declare it a genetic impossibility. Yet the medical records remain. The photographs remain. For the brief time it was permitted to breathe, the child existed. But what will haunt you long after this video ends is this. Sarah Mae was only 17 years old. And when the authorities demanded to know the identity of the father, every adult male in her family, her father, her uncle, her grandfather, and even her own brother, stepped forward to claim responsibility. This was not an act of shame or confession, but one of pride. They were guarding something they referred to as the pure line. A family tradition, maintained with care for over a century in the Appalachia Hills, where outsiders never wandered and violence was the answer to questions. The child survived for 6 days. In those 6 days, it would force medical textbooks to be rewritten and expose a family secret so grotesque the FBI would ultimately classify the case files, sealing them from the public for 5 decades. Those files were quietly declassified in 2021. Hardly anyone noticed. Hardly anyone knows what lies within them. Tonight, you will discover why certain truths are buried so deep that to speak them aloud feels like trespassing on sacred, cursed ground. The Whitaker name first entered the census records of Roanoke County, Virginia, in 1847, when Joshua Whitaker claimed 200 acres of mountain land no other settler would take. The soil was barren, the winters harsh, and the nearest town was a 3-day journey through dangerous terrain. But Joshua wasn't seeking prosperity. He was seeking isolation. And in those remote hollers, where morning mist clung to the mountainsides like secrets refusing to lift, the Whitaker family commenced an experiment that would last 5 generations. Joshua arrived with 2 wives, his legal wife, Martha, and her younger sister, Rebecca, whom he claimed as a companion under frontier law. A local preacher, desperate for any congregation in the wilderness, blessed both unions. By 1855, Joshua had sired 14 children with the 2 sisters. But here the story makes its first dark turn. When those children came of age, they did not seek spouses from neighboring families. They married one another. A disturbing philosophy was revealed in family journals discovered decades later in a hidden cellar under the original homestead. Joshua was convinced that mixing bloodlines weakened the human spirit, diluting what he called the divine essence God had placed in his family line. He persuaded his children they were chosen, special, and that this purity must be preserved at any cost. By the 1880s, the Whitaker family tree was no longer a tree. It was a twisted vine, coiling back on itself repeatedly. The children born from these unions were different. Neighbors whispered about Whitaker offspring who never spoke, who walked with strange gaits, whose eyes held an emptiness that seemed to look through you. After 1890, local doctors refused to attend Whitaker births, declaring the family was cursed. But the family saw not a curse. They saw perfection. Each generation intensified the practice, believing they were approaching a kind of genetic ideal that the corrupt outside world could never comprehend. By 1920, the Whitaker bloodline had become something that defied natural law. What began as marriages between siblings had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. The family had created what they termed the rotation system, a meticulously planned schedule where each fertile woman would bear children from multiple male relatives in a predetermined sequence. They kept scrupulous records, managing human reproduction like a livestock breeding program. Sarah Mae's grandmother, Charity Whitaker, born in 1925, was the product of a union between her mother and 3 different men, her grandfather, her grandfather's brother, and her own uncle. Genetic analysis conducted decades later would show that Charity's DNA contained patterns that should have been biologically impossible. She was simultaneously her mother's daughter, niece, and cousin. Her chromosomes told a story of such concentrated inbreeding that modern geneticists first assumed the test samples were contaminated. But Charity survived, and more disturbing still, she thrived within the family's twisted ecosystem. She was raised to believe the outside world was filled with inferior beings, genetic mongrels who had polluted their bloodlines with foreign influences. By 15, she was pregnant with her first child, fathered by her own father, who was also her uncle and her cousin. This child, Thomas Whitaker, would become Sarah May's father. Though the word father becomes meaningless when you grasp the true nature of the family structure. The Whitakers had forged their own isolated society with its own rules, its own logic, and its own definition of normal. Children grew up not knowing which adults were their parents, siblings, or cousins, for these distinctions had long since ceased to exist. Everyone was related to everyone else in multiple ways. In hushed whispers, they spoke of the blood calling to blood, convinced that each new generation brought them closer to achieving what they called the perfect circle, a state of genetic purity that would grant them abilities beyond ordinary human understanding. By the 1960s, when Sarah May was born, the family had been entirely cut off from the outside world for over a century. They possessed their own language, their own customs, and their own terrible secret, which they guarded more fiercely than their own lives. That secret was preparing to enter the world. And when it did, it would shatter every assumption about the limits of human genetic deformity. Sarah May Whitaker was 17 when she understood she was carrying something that felt different from the other pregnancies she had seen in her family. By that age, she had already given birth twice, once at 14, and again at 16. Both children had died within hours, their tiny bodies too malformed to sustain life. The family called these deaths offerings to the blood, necessary sacrifices on the path to genetic perfection. But this pregnancy was different. Sarah May could feel the child moving in ways that defied explanation. Rather than the gentle kicks of a normal fetus, she described sensations that terrified even her hardened relatives. The child seemed to pulse instead of move, creating rhythmic waves across her abdomen that resembled nothing so much as trapped lightning. By the 7th month, her belly had grown to an enormous size, stretching her skin until it was translucent and revealing a network of dark veins that appeared to writhe beneath the surface. The family was ecstatic. The elders whispered that this was finally it, the culmination of their century-long breeding program. They had achieved something beyond human, something that would prove their superiority to the corrupt outside world. With the fervor of religious zealots, they prepared for the birth, establishing elaborate rituals and ceremonies to welcome what they believed would be their genetic messiah. But Sarah May was dying. The pregnancy was consuming her body from within. Even as her belly expanded, she lost 40 pounds. Her hair fell out in clumps. Her teeth loosened and began to drop from her gums. Most disturbing of all, her eyes began to change color, shifting from brown to an unnatural pale yellow that seemed to glow in the dark. The family interpreted these changes as signs of divine transformation. However, medical experts who later studied her case files identified them as symptoms of severe genetic toxicity. Her body was being literally poisoned by the abnormal fetus growing inside her. When Sarah May went into labor on October 13, 1971, she had been unconscious for 3 days. The family transported her to the nearest hospital, a small rural facility 30 miles away, solely because they wanted medical documentation of what they believed would be the birth of a new form of human being. They never imagined this decision would expose their secret to the outside world, or that the child Sarah May delivered would become the subject of classified government research for the next 50 years. In her 20-year career at Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Margaret Powell had delivered over 3,000 babies. She had witnessed every complication, every deformity, every tragedy that human birth could produce. But when the Whitaker family carried Sarah May through the emergency room doors that October morning, Dr. Powell knew instantly she was about to witness something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The birth lasted 14 hours. Sarah May never regained consciousness. Her body was racked by contractions so violent they shattered 2 of her ribs. The medical team struggled to monitor the fetus because its heartbeat produced patterns their equipment could not properly read. Instead of a steady rhythm, the monitors displayed irregular clusters of activity that more closely resembled brain waves than cardiac function. Nurse Patricia Williams, who assisted with the delivery, later testified that the sound from Sarah May's womb was not a normal fetal heartbeat, but something that sounded almost like whispering. When the child finally emerged, complete silence fell over the delivery room. What Dr. Powell saw defied every principle of human anatomy she had ever learned. The infant was technically alive. It breathed, its heart beat, its eyes moved, but it was shaped in ways that seemed to mock the very concept of human form. Its skull was grossly enlarged, nearly double the size of a normal newborn's head, yet transparent enough that the brain was visible through the skin. That brain was unlike anything in medical literature. Instead of the normal folded structure, it seemed composed of dozens of smaller, separate organs that pulsed independently. The child's limbs were fused in impossible configurations. Its arms emerged from its torso at wrong angles, ending in hands with too many fingers arranged in spiral patterns. Its legs were twisted around each other like vines, and where feet should have been, there were instead formations that resembled tiny faces, complete with moving eyes and mouths that opened and closed without a sound. Most disturbing of all was the child's face, or faces, because there were 3 of them, overlapping and sharing features in a way that created an expression of constant, silent screaming. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because what happened next would test the limits of human compassion and medical ethics in ways that still divide experts today. The child was alive, but was it human? Did it deserve to live, or was keeping it alive an act of immeasurable cruelty? Dr. Powell had 6 days to answer questions that would challenge everything she believed about medicine, morality, and the nature of life itself. The child Sarah May delivered was not expected to survive. Every medical principle suggested such severe deformities would be incompatible with life. Yet somehow, this twisted amalgamation of human genetics continued to breathe, to move, to exist in a state that challenged the very definition of living. Dr. Powell decided to keep it alive, not from hope, but from a terrible scientific curiosity about what the limits of human biology could actually sustain. For 6 days, the medical staff at Mercy General Hospital became reluctant witnesses to something that felt more like a supernatural phenomenon than a medical case. The child never cried. Instead, it produced sounds nurses described as somewhere between humming and static electricity. Its multiple eyes moved independently, tracking different objects around the room with an intelligence that seemed impossible given its malformed brain structure. Most unsettling of all, it appeared to respond to the presence of its family members in ways that suggested recognition, even affection. The Whitaker family maintained a constant vigil around the child's incubator. They spoke to it in their strange dialect, sang songs no one else could comprehend, and performed rituals that horrified the hospital staff. They brought items from their mountain home, twisted pieces of wood, stones arranged in specific patterns, and photographs of other family members displaying generations of increasingly severe deformities. They called the child the culmination and the perfect one, treating it with a reverence that was both touching and profoundly disturbing. But the child was dying, and its death was unlike anything medical science had documented. Instead of the gradual organ failure typical of severely malformed infants, this child seemed to be dissolving from the inside out. Its transparent skin began to develop dark patches where internal structures were breaking down, but rather than causing distress, these changes appeared to bring the child a kind of peace. Its multiple faces, which had shown constant agitation for the first 5 days, began to relax into expressions that almost resembled contentment. On the 6th day, as the morning shift arrived to check on the child, they discovered something that would haunt them forever. The child was still alive, still breathing, but during the night, it had somehow arranged itself into a position that was geometrically impossible given its fused limbs. It lay in the incubator in a perfect spiral, its twisted body forming a pattern that resembled ancient symbols none of the staff could identify. And in that position, with what appeared to be a smile on each of its 3 faces, the child finally died, taking with it the darkest secret of American family genetics and leaving behind questions that remain unanswered to this day. Within hours of the child's death, federal agents swarmed Mercy General Hospital. They arrived in unmarked vehicles, wearing suits that seemed out of place in rural Virginia, carrying briefcases and equipment the hospital staff had never seen. They claimed to be from the Centers for Disease Control, investigating what they called a potential genetic hazard to public health. But Dr. Powell knew instantly these men were something else entirely. The agents confiscated everything. The child's body, all medical records, the photographs the family had brought, even the twisted pieces of wood from their mountain home. They interviewed every staff member who had contact with the case, making them sign documents that legally forbade them from ever discussing what they had witnessed. The official death certificate listed the cause as multiple congenital anomalies, a bland medical term that revealed nothing of the true horror that had occurred. Sarah May died 3 days later, her body finally succumbing to the genetic toxicity that had been consuming her throughout the pregnancy. Devastated by the loss of what they considered their greatest achievement, the Whitaker family retreated to their mountain compound and were never seen in public again. Local authorities who later tried to investigate their property reported the buildings abandoned, though neighbors insisted they could still hear voices singing in the woods on certain nights. The truth the government worked so hard to conceal was revealed in the classified files released 50 years later. The child born to Sarah May Whitaker represented something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human genetics and evolution. Its DNA contained sequences that appeared entirely artificial, as if the family's genetic code had been deliberately manipulated for generations. Most disturbing of all, analysis of the family's genealogical records showed their breeding program had not been random or accidental. It had followed a specific pattern, a genetic formula seemingly designed to produce exactly what Sarah May had given birth to. A single chilling paragraph concludes the classified report. The Whitaker case suggests the possibility of intentional genetic experimentation spanning multiple generations, conducted by unknown parties for unknown purposes. The family's isolation and systematic breeding program indicate a level of organization and long-term planning that exceeds what would be expected from isolated rural populations. Further investigation is recommended to determine if similar programs exist elsewhere in the United States. That investigation never happened, at least not officially. But somewhere in the Appalachia Mountains, in places where outsiders never venture and questions are still answered with violence, there may be other families following other programs, working toward other culminations we are not prepared to understand. The story of Sarah May Whitaker and her impossible child is over, but the questions it raises about the hidden corners of American genetics and the forces that might be manipulating them remain as dark and unanswered as the mountain hollers where such secrets are born.